Thanks for joining us as we dive headfirst into all things people, power, and politics. This is The Pulse. I'm Rep Raj. It is that time. You know, your phone is constantly dinging, has so much news on it, one headline after another, hard to keep up, but that's where we come in. We've got the news that you need, so you can toss that phone aside. A Republican state lawmaker wants Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson impeached. State Representative Jim DeSana introduced articles of impeachment against her. We're hearing from him. Also, we're hearing from Secretary herself as to how she's responding. And the attack in Boulder, Colorado, putting the fight against anti-Semitism back in the spotlight where it belongs. There's so much spotlight that's needed on this issue. We're hearing from a Jewish state lawmaker, Noah Arbit, about what he says needs to happen to fight this issue right here at home. And that attack in Boulder is where we begin tonight, because we're actually learning immigration authorities have detained the suspect's family. 12 people calling for the release of Israeli hostages were hurt after prosecutors say the suspect threw Molotov cocktails at them. He was disguised as a gardener during the attack. The suspect was living in the U.S. illegally, and authorities are investigating what his family knew, if anything. The attack drawing sharp rebukes in Washington, both on Capitol Hill and at the White House.
Seen two horrific cases of anti-Semitic violence in our country in the last 2 weeks, and it is unacceptable to this president and this White House. And rest assured, to all Jewish Americans across our great country, this president has your back.
What starts as legitimate critiques against the Israeli government can easily slip into something far more sinister. If disagreements are allowed to morph into intolerance, if intolerance is permitted to spread and linger, if bigoted voices are allowed to take over legitimate debates, history shows that the threat of violence is never too far away.
The suspect faces charges at both the state and federal levels, accusing him of a hate crime and attempted murder. All eyes on the Senate tonight as President Trump's so-called big beautiful bill faces an uncertain future. Democrats, as we know, are united against it, but not all Republicans are actually bored with it. In fact, now one of his former closest advisors, Elon Musk, is criticizing House lawmakers who voted on it, calling the bill an abomination. Republicans can only afford to lose 3 votes for it to actually pass, and some say they won't just rubber stamp it. Senator Rand Paul saying he's concerned about the bill adding to the deficit.
For the tax cuts. I am for a lot of the bill, but I can't in good conscience give up every principle that I stand for and every principle that I was elected upon.
Just like 215 House members put their thumbprints on it, we want to be able to put ours on it as well.
Behind the smoke and mirrors lies a cruel and draconian truth. Tax breaks for the ultra-wealthy, paid for by gutting health care for millions of Americans.
Senator Schumer is referring to those proposed cuts to Medicaid. Despite the skepticism in his party, Senate Majority Leader John Thune says he still hopes to have the bill on the president's desk by the 4th of July. Well, the clock is ticking in President Trump's trade war tonight. July 9th is when the 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs actually expire. But the White House is telling trading partners they have until tomorrow to make their best offers. They hope to have dozens of deals done by that July 9th deadline. So far, the only one done is with the UK. China is especially complicated with that truce on right now, but both sides accusing the other of violating the deal. Investors, well, they're not sure how negotiations are going to go moving forward.
Have complied with the terms that we set, and our administration officials continue to be engaged in correspondence with their Chinese counterparts.
I just got back from China last week. They're not scared, folks. There's notion they're going to come bow to America. I wouldn't count on that.
Since the trade war started, we've been keeping a really close eye on Wall Street. Here's where things finished on Tuesday. As you can see, the Dow actually today up 214, the Nasdaq in the green 156, the S&P up 34 as well. Like we always say, this news cycle is like drinking from a fire hose. So let's pick up the pace and run through some of the other big stories we're following right now. Starting with a story that could impact women across the country. The Trump administration announcing it's revoking guidance to hospitals requiring them to provide emergency abortions. The Biden administration put out the guidance shortly after the Supreme Court tossed out Roe v. Wade. It was an effort to make sure women having a medical emergency could get an abortion to prevent serious health complications or even death. The Trump administration says it won't enforce that rule. To the courtroom, where a judge ruled the Federal Bureau of Prisons must keep providing hormone therapy and social accommodations to hundreds of transgender inmates. That comes after an executive order signed by President Trump disrupted treatments. The order telling the Bureau to revise its policies so funds aren't used, quote, for the purpose of conforming an inmate's appearance to the opposite sex. That's quoting from the order itself. The judge said federal law bans prison officials from arbitrarily depriving inmates of medication and certain lifestyle accommodations the Bureau's medical staff deem appropriate. And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has ordered a ship named after this man be renamed. We're talking about the USNS Harvey Milk. It's named after a gay rights activist who served as a sailor in the Korean War. Milk later became one of the first openly gay candidates voted to public office when he served on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. He was assassinated by a former supervisor who voted against Milk's bill banning discrimination in public accommodations, housing, and employment based on sexual orientation. Hegseth says the change is part of reestablishing the warrior culture. It comes at the start of Pride Month and as the Pentagon tries to force transgender troops out of the military. Now, before we go to break, a big part of the conversation for next year's midterms is some people's dissatisfaction with the two-party system. Are you on board with these two? We know Mayor Mike Duggan is trying to use that to his advantage as he runs for governor as an independent. I had the chance to talk to him quite a bit on Mackinac, and you know what? He's getting a lot of traction, but we wanted to know how much faith you have in this two-party system. I asked you the question on social media. Here's what so many of you told me. Hey, Lisa, thanks for writing in. We should have a third party. Well, there are independents out there, right? Albert says 2 choices. Doesn't sound like much of a choice. Umpy says, I would say following the 2024 election that we may end up with 3 parties, possibly 4, as both Republicans and Democrats have major fractures within their parties. And Sonia, we thank you for your message. It's been broken for decades. Of course, we always want to hear your opinion, but one of our favorite things to do is on the Pulse is to answer your political questions or fact check something you saw on social media. You can always email thepulse@fox.com or scan that QR code on your screen. Believe it or not everything you read on social media is true. Believe that. We look forward to hearing from you. We'd love to fact check some of the things that you're reading on your phone. We're turning back to the Boulder attack after the break because this and the killing of 2 Israeli staff members in D.C. put anti-Semitism back in the spotlight. Let's rip politics out of this and talk about this with a Jewish state lawmaker with what needs to be done to stop the hate. You're watching The Pulse on Fox 2. Back now on The Pulse, looking at all things people, power, and politics. Joining us now to talk about how to combat the rise of anti-Semitism, both at the state and the national level, hopefully across our world. State Representative Noah Arbit, good to see you. Thanks for joining us, as always, on The Pulse.
Thanks for having me.
You know, we usually have you on here with somebody else arguing about something that is happening in our political world.
Right.
This is, there's no argument here. This kind of hate that we're seeing is just absolutely sickening, and it makes so many people just want to know what is being done. And I think that's one thing that I really liked about what I saw you do yesterday is you said, we can't just sit here and talk about it. We can't just hold news conferences. You introduced a bill. What does that bill do and say?
Yeah, so this morning I introduced the Michigan Anti-Semitism Protection Act. And what the Michigan Anti-Semitism Protection Act, or MAPA, as I call it, would do is really promulgate a guideline, a definition of what anti-Semitism is. One of the things I think is really important to understand about anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish racism is that it's often for people who are not, initiated or educated about, sort of the vagaries of anti-Semitism, it can be difficult to understand how it manifests, how it looks, how it sounds. There are a lot of different dimensions to anti-Semitism, and it's one of those things that it morphs over time and plays through millennia, and it looks different and sounds different depending on who the messenger is, and it can take on different ideological valences between left wing, right wing, center, conspiracies, lies, whatever. And so having a standard where state authorities, agencies, and we're only talking about discrimination, which civil rights discrimination, housing, employment, education. We're not talking about crimes. That's the hate crime legislation that we already got passed into law that I sponsored. But we're talking about civil rights violations. And in order to identify, you can't fight something if you don't know what it is, what it sounds like, or what it looks like. And so we think that putting this into law will help state agencies better identify anti-Semitic discrimination.
And I imagine that that is the huge challenge, and perhaps one thing that's standing in the way of being able to say, look, I know hate when I feel it and see it, but I don't know if there's any kind of law that says you can't or can't do this. Let me ask you a question. This is a complicated one. We've sat at this desk for years now talking a little bit about, for instance, signs of people holding up, let's say, to college campus that say something like, from the river to the sea. And when people see those signs, some people who are Jewish may say, that's a threat. And other people may say, that's an expression, my right to a freedom of expression. How does this legislation draw the line between what's uncomfortable and what's illegal?
So I think what's important to understand about civil rights violations is usually regarding denial of services, public accommodations, employment, housing, discrimination, education. And so those things, you can use the basis on what did you deny those services to someone based on. And if you deny those services on the basis of their religion or their ethnicity, that's the other thing that's complicated about Judaism and Jewishness, is that there's a religious dimension to it, there's also a national dimension to it, and there's an ethnic dimension to it. And so the religion being protected in the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act doesn't quite cover all the ways anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish racism manifests today. And so having
there's anti-Zionism.
Well, there's anti-Zionism, of course, which I believe is the same thing as anti-Semitism, and we can talk about that. But I think to answer your question, that's hate speech is not illegal. Hate speech is not criminal. It is protected constitutional speech. But it's also deleterious to our democracy, and it's also not just offensive, it actually provides the permission structure for violence, because the relationship between hate speech and targeted violence is cause and effect.
And we've seen that in Boulder, and we saw that in Washington with that couple that was killed. I mean, right outside the museum. We
saw it in the Pittsburgh shooting.
Yeah.
I mean, the manifesto that these mass shooters put out is riddled with conspiracies and lies that have been ginned up in part by politicians.
When you look at what needs to happen in order to protect not just Jews, but you're sitting here talking to an Indian American guy, you have friends and family that are of all cultures and variety. This is not just to protect people who are Jewish, although that's what we're saying here.
Yes, of course.
This really does extend to everybody. Your Muslim friends, your Christian friends, your Hindu friends. Talk about that for a moment.
Well, I think it's really important, and that's why I worked so hard and, through sheer brute force was able to pass the Michigan Hate Crime Act last fall and see it become law this April to make sure that we are strengthening our laws. But here's the reality, and what I've always said is that, we can't write a bill that gets rid of anti-Semitism or anti-Black racism or Islamophobia or xenophobia or homophobia. What we can do is tackle hate when it dovetails with the criminal act. What we can do is fund programs and that interrupt radicalization. What we can do is provide safe communities and fulfilling job opportunities and neighborhoods that are safe and welcoming to provide meaning, purpose, and belonging for all Michiganders. That's the work that we have to do prophylactically, because that works against violence and that works against radicalization. One of the things that I'm also doing is calling on Governor Whitmer to create a statewide commission similar to other commissions that exist in other states around targeted violence prevention, and to work with education professionals, law enforcement professionals, intelligence, and all of the above to create a statewide strategy.
Representative Arbit, we only have about 30 seconds left. The social responsibility that the people on the other side of that camera have when they're on their phones posting.
That's right.
And putting messages out there.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, but so much of what we see on social media is a cesspool of hate.
That's right.
The responsibility that people have not to reshare things that they don't know are true, and et cetera. That's important, isn't it? It's a big piece of
It's one of the most important things that people can do. Call out hate. Make sure that we are cultivating spaces among our families, our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues, where hate has no purchase. The only way that it spreads, the only way that violence is allowed to fester against Jews or other communities is if the hate speech, the hate rhetoric is allowed to become normalized and mainstreamed, and then those people, those communities that are actually the target of that, actually become legitimate targets of violence.
Representative Noah Arbit, hey, you know what? No one should, I would say, be able to argue against what you're trying to do here, and we certainly wish your bill well and moving forward. Thank you for your time.
I appreciate it.
Noah Arbit with us. Another state lawmaker wants Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson impeached. We're hearing from him about why, plus the Secretary's response, and debating the news of the day. A loaded segment is next. You're watching The Pulse here on Fox 2. It is People, Power, and Politics. Welcome back to Detroit's only nightly political talk show. Joining us now to debate the hottest political topics, Republican State Representative Jim DeSana and Jeremy Johnson, the host of the Head in the Office podcast. And we thank you both for joining us here on The Pulse. Two sides of the political coin, so to speak, discussing some really important issues here. One, we'll begin with this impeachment. And Jim DeSana, your name has been in the news all week long because of this. You say that basically, kind of review it, there was an $82,000 donation that was made by Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson to Kyra Harris Bolden right before there was a case against Benson that was arising in the court. There was also a presumption of validity when it came to the auditing of the ballots. All of this, you say, leads to impeachment. Is that extreme?
No, and a matter of fact, the presumption of validity is on the signatures on the absentee ballot applications. There's no presumption of validity in the law. So Secretary Benson is by far the most lawless Secretary of State we have had in Michigan history. She has violated the law many times. And the $82,500 donation to the Kyra Harris Bolden for re-election committee was 4 months before she had a case before her. When you look at the deletion of the electronic poll books 7 days after the canvass, that's not in the law. Federal statute requires that you save the records for 22 months. So we're violating so many different things, and it's just flaunting the law over and over.
You know, and I want to give an opportunity for Secretary Benson to have her voice heard here in a moment. We will. She has a statement that she put out, but I do want to ask you, the optics of this. It appears as though this is a woman who's a front runner in the Democratic race for governor. And it appears as though, for many people who are watching, that this is simply a political witch hunt. Something that we saw, of course, was accused, they accused Democrats of doing against President Trump when he was running for president. How are you any different?
Well, this is looking back at all of the violations of the law. We are the lawmakers. She's breaking the laws that we have made.
But that's what Democrats said about President Trump.
Well, and we're the only body right now that can hold her accountable. The Attorney General is not holding her accountable. The Supreme Court is not holding her accountable. If you look at the law, we are the only entity that can hold her accountable. She violated the law when she announced her re-election. When she announced her for governor.
The Attorney General did come up with a rebuke on that, but there's no penalty. But that's by nature of the law. There's no penalty. But there was a statement on that, Jim. Important point you make there. But I think it's important also to include a Democratic voice here. I want to ask you, Jeremy, what your thoughts are when you see all of this unfold in front of you.
Sure. I mean, as a constituent, as a young person, as someone who doesn't have any personal allegiance to Jocelyn Benson, it kind of just feels like the Michigan Republican Party has nothing better to do right now. I'd much rather than be focused on managing the incoming Medicaid cuts that their party is pushing at a national level, which I know we're going to be talking about a little bit later tonight. But look, on the issue of election integrity, to me, Republicans have lost all legitimacy. They've been lying about voter fraud for the last several years, for like the last 5 years, every time we've had an election in this state. So I don't really care much for what they have to say about it now.
When you hear Jeremy say that, but you also, Representative, hear a lot of people say, wait a minute here, this has been adjudicated time and time again by Republican bodies as well, both here in Michigan and elsewhere. The election of 2020 is in the past, and it was done perhaps with some irregularity in some instances, but not illegally. Why then continue this fight?
The courts have ruled over and over against Jocelyn Benson. And as far as voter fraud goes, we have proven voter fraud. And we have illegals voting in our election. They've now come out and said there were 15 illegals that voted in the election. I believe it's much higher than that. I have incidences even in my own township where the Secretary of State's head of security placed a person in the qualified voter file against the rules, against the law, and that vote counted. That vote was tabulated.
But Representative, even if you counted those 15 people and you doubled and tripled it, it still wouldn't have changed the election results for Donald Trump to lose the election. Is that something you consider?
Yes. If you look at over the past 3.5 years and the violations of the statute, and the violations of the law and the qualified voter file. It's not just about a 2020 election. It goes on from there and on. We need integrity. This speaks to the exact opposite of the integrity of our elections, what she is doing to violate the law.
I want Representative, thank you for your time, and I want to get Ms. Benson in here for a moment. She actually released this statement to the media saying this is Republican lawmakers abusing their authority to access sensitive election information that would allow them or any conspiracy theorists they share it with to tamper with election equipment, interfere with the chain of custody of ballots, or impersonate a clerk on election day. She goes on to say, let's be clear, this clown show, she calls it, is leading no way to govern. It is not how we solve problems. It is not how we make government work for everyone. And every taxpayer dollar wasted on these shenanigans is a waste of time and money. We're going to leave that there because what you're pushing right now is going to take a lot of people to vote in the Senate in order to make it happen. But of course, we'll follow the news.
And my articles of impeachment have nothing to do with what she mentioned there.
I understand, and I understand what yours have to do with, and I also understand that she's saying that there's no reason for this, and she's calling it a political, not in so many words, a political witch hunt. I do want to talk to you about some other issues. Representative DeSana, are you concerned about the Medicaid cuts and kind of the work requirements that they're talking about, having to check in twice a year? Do you think this is going to hurt people here in Michigan? What do you think about that?
I don't. I think able-bodied citizens, not single moms, this does not target single moms, and I don't think 80 hours a month is unreasonable for an able-bodied person, either education or work requirement. That's 20 hours a week. Also, we know that illegal immigrants have received Medicaid benefits. These cuts or these regulations that are looking to root out the fraud in the Medicaid system are a good thing. I believe that people who are deserving of Medicaid that potentially would be on the brink, we can look at those and say, no, this has definitely not hit the target. The target we're trying to hit is able-bodied people who are on Medicaid, and I don't think 20 hours a week is a lot to ask.
Jeremy, when you hear about these Medicaid work requirements, checking in twice a year, what goes through your mind right away about these potential cuts?
I think it's going to be a disaster. I mean, Arkansas, I believe in 2018, tried to implement work requirements to their Medicaid program. Something like 18,000 people lost their health care, and it didn't have an effect on employment at all. I don't think Republicans, my opinion is that Republicans don't care who they're going to hurt with this bill. And we saw just a couple of days ago, Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa was doing a town hall, and one of her constituents raised exactly this issue. They said people are going to die. And she said, well, we're all going to die. They don't care. I think there's a lot to hate in this big, beautiful budget. But one thing that deserves our unbridled animosity is the clear disregard the Republican Party seems to have for human life.
What about the work requirements when you hear about people who may be able-bodied and able to go work and who aren't? If they can try to rectify that, perhaps not in this bill, but in general, do you think that there's a legitimate call to do so?
The stats don't bear this out. The vast majority of people on the Medicaid program are already working. I mean, Medicaid covers your basic physical health care. Doesn't cover anything else. You still got to pay rent. You still got to pay for food. You still got to make sure you can pay for all of your other expenses. Just getting Medicaid isn't this like ticket to do absolutely nothing. It's this idea that the American population is somehow lazy. They're not. Medicaid, people on Medicaid are already working. Implementing these work requirements is purely just going to put a pile of paperwork in front of people and force them off the program.
Senator Rand Paul is one Republican senator, representative who is kind of standing tall against this, saying that it's going to increase the national debt by more than $4 trillion. Elon Musk is saying this is an abomination. Do you happen to see any truth with what Elon Musk or Rand Paul have to say?
Well, I acknowledge those as good points. As you know, I'm on the conservative side of the spectrum, and I would like to see a lot more direction towards a balanced budget at the federal level. So I don't know that we're cutting enough. We're never going to get a perfect bill. This is the political process. It's very difficult. They've got to get something through that they can get signed in the Senate. As far as the cuts, I wish there were more cuts. We're going down a cliff here, and I don't think that's a whole other subject we can talk about. But there's an economic cliff, and it's called, 32 trillion headed towards 35 trillion, and it just keeps going and going.
Well, and this bill does not help to promise to cut the debt at all. And
I have those same concerns, exactly, just like Rand Paul.
I'll tell you what, this is a conversation that will take more of these, and we hope to have you both back. We thank you very much for your time, Representative and Jeremy. Good to see you both.
Thanks for having me.
That is the Pulse for tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. As always, I'm Rep Raj. It was good to be with you. Thank you both.